Not hearing anything.
All right, welcome. We are glad you're here with us today. We're going to give it a couple more seconds for people to trickle into our call. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Lindsay Wyckoff, and I'm the Director of Regional Integrated Marketing for the American Cancer Society. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's event. We ask that if you have multiple people listening on one line, if you could please put your names and organizations in the chat so we have record of your attendance, that would be very helpful. Attendance for everyone else will be recorded automatically. During the presentations, all lines will be muted, and we will ask that all questions be entered into the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions during the panel discussion as time permits. And if we don't have time to answer your question during the panel, we will work separately with the presenters to have your question answered post-event. As we get started, we want to learn a little bit more about the people who are joining us today. So if you could please answer the poll question and let us know what sector you represent, we would really appreciate it. Couple more seconds. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that information. It's greatly helpful as we continue to plan these for the future, and we're so excited that you're all here. Before we begin our program, we want to recognize and thank our sponsors. Absolutely would not be possible without them. Without the generous support of the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center, the James, and United Healthcare, this program wouldn't be happening. So thank you to both of them. Also, thank you to the Ohio Partners for Cancer Control and Mountains of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Coalitions for their continued support of our webinars. We're going to go through our agenda quickly today. We are going to kick it off with a caregiver story, followed by 4 incredible presentations from our speakers, and then we will have our panel discussion. We will include at the end some information about the American Cancer Society, including some information about a new resource we recently launched, as well as some housekeeping items. The AAFP has reviewed navigating current issues in cancer clinical trials and deemed it acceptable for up to 2 enduring materials self-study AAFP prescribed credits. After the presentation, you will receive a certificate to claim your CEs within 2 weeks following completion of the post-event survey. Our objectives for today's event can be seen on the current slide. The planning committee members and speakers have declared that there are no relative financial arrangements or affiliations with the organization that may affect balance, independency, objectivity, or scientific rigor for this CE event other than that displayed on the slide. Also, please note that the slides will be available following the presentation, and we're also recording today's presentation. Now it is my absolute honor to introduce one of my favorite people that I've met through working here at ACS. We really like to start off each session with a reminder of the people who are impacted by the topic of our discussion. Today, we're going to hear the story of an amazing man who gained 30 additional years through clinical trials. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Bond. Kathleen is a dedicated leader with extensive experience in the American Cancer Society. She has served on various boards, committees, including the Ohio, West Virginia, and Northern Kentucky area board since 2021. She also has served on the ACS National Volunteer Impact Panel from 2020 to 2024. She's incredible. Kathleen is the founder and co-chair of the American Cancer Society Pan-Ohio Hope Ride, which is a 328-mile, 4-day biking event that has raised over $14 million since its inception. Additionally, Kathleen was a caregiver for her husband, James Bond, who was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 1992. Kathleen, thank you so much for continuing to share James' legacy. We hope that everyone on the call, oh, I'm sorry. Kathleen, I want to turn it over to you. I apologize. We're so happy you're here and it's so good to see you.
Oh, good to be here. In fact, at this point in my life, it's good to be anywhere. So I'm happy to be with you all today. And thank you for the kind introduction. Yes, my husband is James Bond. And I have to say, he would tell you that he's the real James Bond. He actually was born before those books were even written. So he was the real deal. And sadly, I just lost Jim in December of 2023. So I'm still trying to navigate without my favorite guy, but I'm doing just that. But I want to tell you what a delight it is to be here today. And I'm so glad to see that you're having this kind of discussion. When Jim was diagnosed in 1992 with multiple myeloma, a cancer we had never heard of, I was already a volunteer for the ACS, hoping it would keep the wolf from the door. Well, sadly, it didn't. But there we were faced with this cancer that had a very, very poor prognosis. Nobody was living very long. They were using the same treatments they've been using for 40 some years. There wasn't a lot of excitement and hope, but we decided we were going to get after it and do everything we could. And we were concerned about finding out what works and what works better. And I spent a lot of time in the medical school library at Case Western looking at articles. And this was pre-internet, so it took some real time to do research. But we wanted to know what's possible out there. And we were very fortunate that we had a doctor that felt the same way. So when Jim was diagnosed and told he had 2 to 3 years to live, that was just unacceptable to us. We did everything we could to make that not be the case. And I have to say, as Jim went through his treatments, 4 transplants later, 6 clinical trials later, he managed to live 31 years. And in those 30 years, we saw our kids get married. We saw grandchildren arrive. Jim decided to ride in the Pan Ohio Hope Ride, which I started in 2007, and rode across Ohio for 12 years in a row. He was doing that when there are doctors that probably thought he shouldn't have done it, but he did. But I can tell you at each transplant that Jim had, there were 2 autos, 1 allo, but he actually reached a very critical point in 2002, 10 years into this 31-year journey, and we had run out of options. His sisters had donated her marrow and her stem cells rather, and it wasn't working. Things were looking really dire, and his doctors were talking hospice care. Well, Jim and I had done a lot of research and talked to a lot of other doctors, and we realized there was hope out there because we knew there were clinical trials going on. And we had heard about a clinical trial out of town in Boston, 600 miles away from home. And we were lucky enough to get a hold of those doctors. And Jim got into that trial by the skin of his teeth. Jim was very, very ill. He was doing a home IV. His kidneys were close to failing. It was a very scary time. He was running 104, 105 fever. We showed up in Boston to be in a clinical trial that we hoped he would be in a clinical trial that was supposed to last 9 months. I wasn't sure Jim would get through the next 9 days, but we got there and the doctors took one look at him and said, Jim, we don't want to do anything right now without checking to make sure that you don't have an infection going. Well, fortunately, they believed us that we said this is the inflammatory process of the disease, and they decided it was go time for this trial. And one of the doctors told me, he said, by the way, did anybody tell you that your husband was the 7th patient admitted into our study? So his study number was 007. And he said, I have to believe that's good karma. Well, clearly it was. Jim got through 2 treatments and his cancer level dropped 99%. That led to a new drug that was first in its class that's now standard of care. And it was a drug called Velcade. And amazingly, 2 years after Jim got it, the Nobel Prizes were announced in chemistry. The 3 researchers that opened the pathway that led to Velcade won a Nobel Prize. Number 39 of the 53 the American Cancer Society can claim. But I was just floored. And we were so fortunate that we were able to get to that trial. And when I think about that, and I think about the trial after that Jim was in, a few years later, he was in yet another trial because the cancer started to flare again, but it didn't come raging back. The doctor said, you know what, we've got time to explore something else. And Jim was totally in agreement, as was I, that we would do that. And that led to another advancement, another standard of care treatment, which was Revlimid. So we have been the beneficiaries of the value of clinical trials that kept my husband going, kept him pedaling. And when we started with Pan Ohio in 2007, it was a great metaphor for all of that, for people that keep pedaling, people that are just absolutely and absolutely committed to finding a way to get through the cancer journey. And I have to say that there were a lot of hurdles. A lot of people tell me that they fear clinical trials. You know all this. It's the fear of the placebo, the fear of the cost, the fear of being the guinea pig, everything that people fear. We found there was a way to navigate through that. And the American Cancer Society was hugely helpful in making that happen, especially when it comes to transportation with our Road to Recovery, and especially with places to stay. Now, when we ended up going to Boston, there was no Hope Lodge in Boston. I am proud to say there was now, but we were willing to relocate and just threw keys to a neighbor and took off for 9 months. My husband packed everything he owned. I packed a suitcase because I didn't think I was going to be staying there for 9 months. I thought I would be returning with my husband's body. Luckily, that didn't happen. But I know that as time marched on, we have always continued throughout his journey of 31 years to look at what's possible. We would keep our eye on what is out there and what's doable. And certainly with all these clinical trials going on, there are resources where you can find the best match for your patient, for your loved one. And the American Cancer Society certainly helps with all that. Now, I will say that through all this, Jim was in yet another clinical trial. And as I said earlier, I think there were a total of 6. Not everyone was a home run. But at one point, one of the doctors said to him, Jim, if you enter this trial and it doesn't work, we're still going to benefit from what we learned through you. But it also will make you eligible for something that we really think will be beneficial for you. So we navigated our way in through another clinical trial to find, again, something that looked possible and something that was doable. And we did. And as you go through your discussion today, I hope that you will continue to look at what's possible and what's doable. And from a layman's standpoint, we just want to know what works and what will work better and what will work best. And I believe that it's only through clinical trials that we'll be able to do that. And I think as we reach out and tell the stories, we can enhance trust, make people understand the value in participating in a clinical trial. And I know from our experience, I will do whatever I can to help that happen. Now, as you see these pictures scrolling, there's been a lot of life and a lot of love in our family. And it's because of the medical advances that were made possible through clinical trials and people like you. So again, I just want to thank you. And I want to say, when things look like they look impossible, just focus on what's necessary to do. And next thing you know, you might look back and realize you've accomplished what may have seemed impossible. Clearly, that was our story. It also seemed so impossible that Jim would be pedaling on for 31 years later. And yet he did. And I want to thank you for that. And I'll turn it back over. Thank you so much.
Kathleen, thank you so much. We know that Jim's legacy lives on through the work you're doing and all of the Pan Ohio family. You can see his warmth and the love through those photos. So thank you so much. We hope that everyone on the call today will consider joining us in celebrating the lives of James and all of our other survivors and caregivers by participating in the Pan Ohio Hope Ride. Those of you who love to cycle can sign up at pohr.org. And if you're not a cyclist, you should still join. I experienced my first one last year, and it is the best group of people, and it's an absolute blast. You can volunteer, you can donate. It's a fantastic event that it's such a connection focused event with all of the people participating and that are a part of it. So feel free to join us. And if you're able to donate, we do have an anonymous donor who is matching all donations until April 30th. So just a quick
Yeah.
plug for that as we continue to fundraise for Pan Ohio. So Kathleen, thank you again so much. We loved having you today and hearing your
Oh,
story.
well, thank you very much. And I hope you have a good discussion today.
Thank you.
All righty. Take good care.
You too. It is now my pleasure to welcome our very first presenter, Dr. Mark Fleury. Dr. Fleury is a policy principal for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, where he has worked since 2013. He specializes in research, drug development, and regulatory policies, along with other science and technology related projects. He led a coalition in 2017 that created a report and recommendations focused on overcoming cancer clinical trial enrollment barriers, and is currently the principal investigator on a clinical trial testing the effectiveness of a new automated regional clinical trial screening tool. So much impressive work, Dr. Fleury. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Kathleen, for sharing your story of your husband's journey through clinical trials. Really tough act to follow there. I think it's really important we start off with the why, and your story is a success story that we want to replicate many more times. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes to talk a little bit about the landscape of barriers. As was mentioned, I convened a number of people a few years ago to take a look at the barriers that patients face in clinical trials. And one of the things I want folks to take away from my short presentation is that clinical trial participation is not a single step. It's multiple steps. First of all, there has to be matching clinical trials that align with the patient's clinical criteria. If there is a matching clinical trial, the patient has to actually be pre-screened, because it doesn't do any good to have a clinical trial if you don't actually screen them for eligibility. Next, the patient actually has to be invited to participate. And it's really only at this point where the patient can express their own agency and say yes or no to a clinical trial. And the last step is obviously they get the opportunity to say yes or no. So next slide. So as was mentioned, in 2018, we published this report. We spent about a year doing a deep dive into the literature to really understand where the barriers were, because this is a problem that folks have looked at for a long time, but we really have struggled to make progress. And we wanted to make sure we were all operating from the same set of assumptions about where those barriers were. Next slide, please. So you can go find that on the internet. It still exists, still very valuable. But the Cliffs Notes are right here. There are a lot of barriers, but they all aren't equal. And I think this is one of the biggest takeaways I always try and drive home. If we take 100 patients who walk through the door of an institution with a cancer diagnosis seeking care, we know that on average about 7% will enroll in a therapeutic clinical trial. But what happens to the other 93%? Unfortunately, there's been a lot of assumptions that the other 93% just aren't interested in clinical trials, and that's very far from the truth. It turns out that over 3 out of 4 patients who walk through the door of an institution won't have a clinical trial that matches their clinical criteria. So right out of the bat, most patients are sort of excluded from clinical trial participation. Now, I want to clarify that is at the site where they're being seen. So that number can vary greatly. If you're at an academic medical center, a cancer center, that number may be much smaller. But if you're in the community, that number may be much higher, and that may actually be 100% if you're seen at a site that doesn't offer clinical trials. But on average, if you average out all the sites across the United States, 3 out of 4 patients won't have an on-site clinical trial. Now, that would suggest that a quarter of the patients roughly could enroll in a clinical trial, but it turns out that a significant portion are never asked to enroll, and that's either because they were not screened for eligibility or they were and they fell through the cracks. When we get down to the point of a patient being approached and asked to enroll in a clinical trial, it turns out that more than half will say yes, 55%. So that really pokes a hole in this assumption that we need to really focus on turning no's into yeses. We know that a lot of effort is spent here, but I'm an engineer by training, and if you want to increase clinical trial participation, you can see that 85% of patients today aren't in clinical trials, not because they said no, but because they never had a chance to say yes. And so as we think about trying to create more opportunities for patients, I urge folks to really remember this top portion and not just focus on the bottom, although we do that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about trial availability, it's important that we clarify, is it the case that most patients don't have a clinical trial anywhere for which they're eligible, or is it a site-specific issue? This is a study that we did using real archival patient records at UT Southwestern, and 84 patients, 7 different cancer types. And we found that about 40% of the patients matched to an on-site clinical trial. And again, this is a NCI designated cancer center. We searched for clinical trials within a 20-mile radius, basically the greater Dallas area, and tried to see if more patients would match clinical trials. And even though our basis was a NCI designated cancer center, we could almost double the proportion of patients for whom we matched a clinical trial. Next slide. So what that tells us is that even if you're a big institution, you can find more trials at other sites. And this is another study that we did where we used Commission on Cancer accreditation data and looked at the average enrollment rate across the United States. And about 7% of patients will enroll in therapeutic trials. But if you zoom in on different types of institutions, you see there's a vast, vast discrepancy. So NCI cancer centers enroll over 21% of their patients, whereas community cancer programs only enroll about 4%. So there's a 5-fold difference there. It's not that the patients are drastically different. The difference here, again, is access to clinical trials, because cancer centers obviously have more clinical trials that are open. So again, that is the key. You can't enroll a patient into a trial that you don't offer. Next slide, please. So one other issue that I think has been of great importance and concern is, do we have representative clinical trials? And we've often heard that certain groups won't enroll because they don't trust the medical system, or they're saying no at a higher rate. In our study, many of these, it was a meta-analysis, so it was looking at a number of different studies, and many of them had enrollment rates broken out by race and ethnicity. And what we found is there was no difference in acceptance rate between Blacks, whites, Asians, and Hispanics. And what that tells us, so first of all, I should say that doesn't negate the fact that certain groups may have more mistrust in the medical system, and that there are some important historical issues that we need to be cognizant of. But when it comes to oncology clinical trials, we do not see a difference in acceptance rate. And that suggests that some of the disparities in participation and non-representation are not about the groups themselves, but it's about whether or not they were even offered participation in the first place. So this has to do with where the trials are opened, who is screened and who isn't, and who's offered clinical trials. Next slide. Okay, so some patients do say no. We know that about 45% of patients will say no. And through a variety of surveys, we know there's kind of 4 major reasons, and those are cost, logistics, fear, and desire for control. And I like to bucket these into 2 different buckets. The top 2 are pragmatic. So a patient is not necessarily opposed to clinical trial participation. They would say yes, but they sort of feel like they have to say no because the cost to get to the trial is too high. They can't take off work. It's, at a cancer center across town and things like that. So here is where we can create pragmatic solutions. We can provide financial support. We can help them, navigate them through the system. We can find places for them to stay at Hope Lodges or give them rides to treatment. The latter two are philosophical. These are people who just don't trust science or want to keep control of their treatment decisions, and that's philosophical. And I would posit that, trying to change people's philosophy it is hard, and much harder than helping people with a gas card or, helping navigate them. So our focus has largely been on solving these pragmatic issues, and we have some policy initiatives to try and make it easier for sponsors to provide financial support to clinical trial participants. Next slide. Okay, so in summary, access, access, access. So you cannot get a patient on a clinical trial that you do not have open and available to them. So that is the number 1, 2, 3 reason that patients are on clinical trials. Next, if you have the clinical trials, you need to make sure that you're screening everybody who walks through the door, because again, it doesn't do any good to have a clinical trial if you're not screening them for eligibility and kind of helping hold their hands through that process. Then last, make it really easy and cost neutral to participate. So you need to meet that patient where they are and help them get to yes when they want to. So with that, I'll close and look forward to the conversation at the panel later.
Thank you for that great presentation, Dr. Fleury. It's great to see the representation across clinical trials. And while that 77% of people that are not able to participate because of the barriers, that some of those, there are solutions to saving more lives, that's the good news. And everyone on this call is, I'm sure, committed to doing that. So thank you for sharing that important data with us. Our next speaker today is Dr. Melinda Butch-Kovacic. Melinda is an epidemiologist and community-partnered public health researcher focused on reducing cancer and chronic disease burdens in Cincinnati, with a focus in under-resourced communities. As the Associate Director of Community Outreach and Engagement for the University of Cincinnati Cancer Center, she leads efforts to measure cancer burdens and partner with community organizations for education and screening. Her We Engage for Health program uses community co-designed stories and learning experiences to promote health literacy and research participation. Melinda, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next slide. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a story, and that is how I even became part of this work, because I didn't intend to go this direction when I first started. In 2016, I was one of the people that started the West End Community Research Advisory Board through our CCTST or CCSA funded grant. And this board has been in existence ever since, and I still serve as the faculty liaison. At the time, shortly thereafter, I should say, I had started the We Engage for Health program, which was a science education partnership award through NIGMS. And a lot of the folks on the board said to me, I really would like to be able to talk to my friends and family and neighbors about research, but I really don't know how to do that. And they knew about the stories that I was creating for the point of sharing health, promoting health. So I started working with them, and we came up with a story that we have since iteratively remade as we've used it. And that's what I'm sort of talking about today. Next slide. So what came of this was this concept of research readiness. And we define research ready as having a person be prepared to consider participating in health or medical research. And we kind of use 3 Ps as our kind of foundation of the Research Ready program. Understanding the purpose of research, how people are protected from harm, and why it's important for people of all backgrounds and walks of life to participate. And our goal was really also to help people develop questions to reflect on and to ask the study staff if they were ever to be invited to participate in research. And then, one of the things that happened as we went on is we actually added a whole component about teaching folks about the different types of research. People didn't understand phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and they didn't understand that, some research isn't a brand new drug that's never been tested. They didn't know that sometimes trials involved 2 drugs that were previously approved for a different purpose and are being repurposed or being put together. So we deemed that if a person understood the 3 Ps and knows the kind of questions they could ask and think about, they were suitable to make their own decisions. So this became about helping them to make better decisions. We learned that a lot of folks in the communities that we were working with had a lot of fears and myths. And some of that was promoted by social media, especially during COVID. So next slide. So the co-creation of our story has really evolved over time. We had this whole process where we envision stories, we create a story script, we create a comic layout, and then we test the story. And we use comic style stories because it was engaging, it was easy to use for people of all ages. We have actually used them as low as middle school. And then we also think that they're easy to use to read out loud as the characters, and there's all kinds of science that's showing that the stories actually makes them more memorable and shareable, and so forth. So we created the research ready story first, which I'm going to show you briefly, and I have links throughout this presentation, so if you get the presentation you can get the information as well. And I think she's putting some stuff in the chat as well. But research ready is really a story about a teenager being invited to a study and like trying to understand what he should consider. And the goal is not just the story, it's the discussion that follows the story that was the critical piece. We wanted to have that low stakes, non-judgmental discussion. And we eventually made shorter versions of the story, a 5-panel story that we could use at community events. And along with that, we added the research study review guide, which I'll show you briefly. And then over time, there was some questions about whether or not we could use this with cancer survivors themselves. And Alik Topalian is a 2-time AML survivor that is a research scientist in our institute. And so we invited her to help us kind of bring together a focus group so we could look at the stories in different ways and think about how we would use that story to help people who are cancer patients and cancer survivors. And she was an AYA, so she wanted to really help young adults and folks who may be kind of shying away from treatment because of their early experiences. So we actually developed this story called Becoming Research Ready. Next slide. So this is the short Becoming Research Ready story. The characters here are Monique and Carter, and Monique is the cancer survivor. Carter is a faculty at the university. There's also a character named Pops, but they go through the purpose, protection, and participation. I'll let you guys read this later, but next. And we actually add bubbles and when we try to keep this low literacy, so 3rd to 6th grade reading level. Some words you can't kind of avoid, so we always define them if we can't completely eliminate them or replace them with something easier. Next slide. And then the last slide, we actually added this last. We actually added a whole panel that really kind of addressed some of the myths and what people hear. And so that ends up we added that later as people started telling us their concerns with research. And then the research study guide is also, talks about history and relevance, risk and benefit, and what they're willing to do and what they feel comfortable with. These are things they consider when they think about research. Next slide. So one of the things we really wanted to do is that we wanted to make sure that, people were really hearing us and were willing to have those conversations. And so we started inviting what we called cultural insiders, lay educators, to take trainings for community research advocates. And that way they could have the conversations in the communities that they were part of. For example, the Community Research Advisory Board that I first helped me made the story, they took this training so that they could have those conversations with their family, friends, and neighbors. Eventually, we realized we needed to give them a little bit more support. So we created this research ready discussion plan that's kind of took them through what kind of conversation they needed to have. And a lot of times we would pick a study that we could use as an example study. Sometimes the study was actively recruiting, sometimes they weren't. But that way they could actually look at a study announcement and say, what are the questions that I would ask about this study? How would I feel about it? And in a lot of ways, one of the reasons why we started doing this is because people wanted to we wanted to be able to model how to use the information we were sharing so that if they were ever asked for to be in a study, they could use this information. The other piece is we wanted people to get excited about research. And we also were encouraging them that if they really were interested in research, that they should ask their healthcare providers about it. Some of those hospitals that don't have a lot of research trials to be in, they could say, hey, can you help me find a research trial? So being a bit more proactive. Next slide. So I can't go into 10 minutes, doesn't give me enough time to go into a lot of details, but we have been working on evaluating these stories and how these work. Our longer research ready story, we actually use this in 250 adolescents. and they did paper post-discussion surveys, and we asked them questions about safety and willingness to participate, and also confidence in decision making. We have done a research study with 104 post-discussion surveys after reading a shorter version of the Research Ready story. And that was done at a community event. We had 2 of my interns that were so excited about using Research Ready, and so they were the ones that collected that 104 surveys. We have also been using the longer Becoming Research Ready story at virtual events targeting young cancer survivors. And Alika has been doing that, and she's working on that analysis now. We're also working with our clinical trials office to develop a protocol to offer Becoming Research Ready to some of our hesitant patients. And one of the real, like I said, goal is to make sure that we have people who are cancer survivors. And so we're starting with leukemia because that was what Alika has had. And that helps people kind of identify with the people that they're talking to. Next slide. So real quick, some of our high level results. You can see that when we were this is the longer Research Ready story. The kids, they were willing to participate in research. Most of these kids had never participated in research. I think it was like 6% or something. 81% said they'd participate in research in the future. 90% said they felt safe participating, and 88% said they had better able to make decisions given the Research Ready story. When you look at the bottom half, that's the shorter version of the story. We also asked about what kinds of research they would participate in, and you can see, a lot of people are willing to participate in surveys. Many of them were willing to give samples and medical tests, but again, medicines and treatments is still a lower percentage, so 50 to 60%. And there is some variation by age. So one conversation we know is not going to cause everyone to all of a sudden decide to participate in research, but we want to get things started. Theory of change says that we need to sometimes get this thought in their brain so that when the time comes, they can make a better decision. Next slide. I think it's the last slide too. Yeah, so considering theory of change, the goal is not to convince people to participate in research, but rather to have that discussion so that they can move along that continuum. We know that a single discussion isn't going to always convince someone, but it again can start that conversation. Using stories, we also found, doesn't always resonate with everyone. It's an innovative approach and it's useful, especially in the community. But it's the discussion itself that's going to be really valuable, regardless of whether or not we use the story or not. And we do really believe that having those cultural insiders for cancer survivors serve as research advocates really does help ease the stress of discussions and help people be more open to considering something that they may not necessarily have considered before. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Butch Kovacic. We appreciate you introducing us to Research Ready, and Monique and Carter. What a great way to ease people in and give them the confidence to make decisions and ask questions about their health and the decisions that they should make. Our next speaker will be Dr. Shazia Nakota. Dr. Nakota is a hematologist-oncologist at Fox Chase Cancer Center who specializes in the management of hematologic malignancies. Her research focus is primarily in improving tolerability of anti-cancer therapies for patients by the use of targeted therapies and personalized treatment approaches. She was recently awarded funding through the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Equity and Access Research Grant to evaluate methods of improving opportunities for participation in clinical trials for historically underrepresented populations through provider communication, training, and patient educators focused on clinical trial discussions. Dr. Nakota, I will turn it over to you, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much. I'm honored to be able to participate in this today. So I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on called the Reconnect study. And next slide, please. I think a little background here, you're all very well aware of why clinical trials are so important, and of course, why equitable medical care is so important and why these two are really merged. As a clinician, I think something that not all of my colleagues necessarily remember on a day-to-day basis when we're seeing patients is that referring patients for clinical trial is so important because it really impacts the patient that's sitting in front of you as well. Even if they don't have a trial necessarily for them that day, referring patients for a clinical trial really does improve how we treat cancer care, but also more diverse clinical trial patient populations is important for us to understand differences in disease clearance, toxicity. Patients from different backgrounds will have different gut microbiomes. They will have different comorbidities that impact how they can handle the therapies. And so sitting there giving patients information about standard of care, it's so important that they really are reflected in the trials that we use for decision making. So I think that's just one very important point. And of course, the importance of giving access to cutting edge therapies is just very, very important to our patients. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think Dr. Fleury did a great job addressing all the different barriers to clinical trial enrollment already. And I think he stressed one of the most important issues is that there's a lack of trials from a systems level. And even at major cancer centers, majority of our patients are not always eligible for a clinical trial. So for example, frontline studies may not be always an option for our patients, or patients have a lot of comorbidities or issues with laboratory values that may make them ineligible for recruitment or enrollment. And so pre-screening is really, really important, of course. So that's something that not all facilities have access to. And then sometimes the trial is not available at that site that the patient is seeing their provider. So they may have the trial available through their cancer center at the main campus, for example, but it's not something feasible that the patient can come and do at the site that requires a longer drive or maybe even a flight potentially. And then, of course, there's challenges with providers talking to patients, whether it be they don't have the time, whether they don't really see the value in the clinical trial, and it's not something they incorporate in their day-to-day practice when they treat patients. And then, of course, from patient standpoint, I think Dr. Fleury mentioned this very well, that a lot of patients want to be on a clinical trial if it was simply offered to them. But of course, there's also patients who have some misconceptions and potentially some socioeconomic barriers that could be intervened on if we just explore those a little bit more as well. So next slide, please. So I did an internal investigation at my institution to understand how providers are feeling about clinical trials and what the biggest challenges are. And so one of the biggest challenges that they reported was challenges with time. Clinical trials take a long time to discuss with patients. There's a lot to review. And if you have a 15-minute visit, you might not be able to get all that information shared, especially in patients who have a lot more information to learn that day because of the barriers that they've had, whether misconceptions need to be overcome or, explanation of the basics. And then, of course, the provider themselves might not really see value in it and may want to really just give them the standard of care because they don't think it's really beneficial. It can be hard to keep up to date with what trials are even available for your patients, especially with how challenging cancer care has become. There's so many different disease subtypes, and we treat them all a little differently. So keeping up with standard of care is hard. So keeping up with clinical trials that are available is even more challenging. Of course, there's logistical challenges that I think both of my fellow panelists highlighted here with getting on a clinical trial. And then last but not least, the majority of patients simply don't have a trial available at their site. So let's jump to the next slide. Fox Chase and Temple in Philadelphia, this is where I'm located, is really trying to improve our enrollment of diverse populations on our clinical trials. So I'm really excited to share some of the work that some of my colleagues have done. Dr. Marty Edelman, Linda Fleischer, and Suki Pata are two clinicians and one cancer prevention and control specialist here that we work with at Fox Chase and Temple. And they were awarded grant funding from the Step Up to Cancer grant, which really tried to improve access to phase 1 clinical trials. And I think it really displays how many levels of interventions are needed to achieve this goal of improving access to clinical trials. So next slide, please. So, just the way that targeting or tackling cancer is not one solution. It's thousands of small little solutions that we've found to handle the different types of cancers and lines of therapy, for example. It's a very complex endeavor. And so I think the project, the ADACT study that was funded by this grant, Accelerating Diversifying Access to Clinical Trials, really highlights this. So the first thing this project has done is expanding infrastructure to the Temple main campus, which is on Broad Street in Philadelphia. And it's a very different patient demographic than the one at the main cancer center, which is out in the suburbs. And so this is really improving access, physical access, by opening space for patients to get these trials, recruiting and retaining support staff to help getting the trials up and running, and supporting with all the documents and data monitor and all of those things that need to be done. And it's much easier when they're on site. The next thing that we did was really expand the patient support. So social work, navigation, working with our Philadelphia programs to improve transportation, and improving language translation services as well. And then last but not least, we know how important it is for patients to be able to see people who come from their communities, who have had experience with clinical trials, and really understanding that these studies can represent me as well, and I can be representative of my population, the community that I'm coming from. And so they helped expand the Community Ambassador Program, which utilizes a wonderful group of people who have gone through clinical trials or are advocates for clinical trials to reach out to the community and help dispel some of the myths that or mistrust that comes with clinical trials. So next slide, please. And so I am fairly new to this field. I am primarily a clinician and a researcher, and I was honored to receive this funding support from the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which improves access to clinical trials by looking for intervenable solutions. So not just what the barriers are, but what are the interventions? Next slide, please. And so we decided to look at two interventions. One is educating providers. Can we improve the way that we efficiently talk about clinical trials, focus those conversations about what the patients need to know rather than what we maybe think they need to know, and making sure that this is at a level literacy-wise that works for all of our patients. And then the second option that we want to offer our patients is dedicated trial coordination and education. So another layer of support for patients. Next slide, please. We're going to be partnering with the Vital Talk program, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization that works on communication techniques with providers. And so we'll be using their course to talk about addressing racism and inherent biases. And then we're developing our own course to teach providers on how to talk about clinical trials early on, how to really bring this to a level playing field with standard of care options, and then how to address barriers for patients. Next slide, please. And then the social support really come from the clinical trial educator and coordinator who will help with screening for trial eligibility, addressing barriers, and these two interventions are going to be randomized across the campus for patients and providers, and hopefully we'll get some great data from there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Nakota. Really looking forward to seeing the Reconnect study results. We might have to have you back on to talk about those.
We'll love it.
As we eliminate those barriers. Our final presenter will be Dr. Cheryl Lee. Dr. Lee is professor and chair of the Department of Urology at The Ohio State University, holding the Dorothy M. Davis Endowed Chair in Cancer Research and serving as the deputy director of the Center of Community Outreach and Engagement at the OSU Comprehensive Cancer Center. Her medical professional focus is dedicated to improving the care of bladder cancer patients through advocacy, education, and research, and she has served in various leadership roles, including the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network and the American Cancer Society. Dr. Lee is currently a trustee of the American Board of Urology and a member of several prestigious surgical societies, and she has received multiple distinguished service awards. Dr. Lee, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you and good morning. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to give a clinician's perspective on patient representation. I think we may hear some similar themes because these are very important to us. Next slide, please. Here are my disclosures, none of which intersect with my remarks today. Next slide, please. So allow me to state the obvious. We've heard about it. Clinical trials are critically important in advancing the treatment of patients not just because it presents a mechanism to test novel agents, but it builds on our understanding of the disease and sets the stage for future discovery. Moreover, participants benefit so they can receive care that they otherwise wouldn't if these trials weren't available. And certainly because the participants have this kind of access, close follow-up, and trial participation usually is associated with better outcomes. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, we know that not everybody is participating, as you've heard from the prior panelists. Many patients don't participate because of mistrust in the system of medical research, and they may have misconceptions about clinical research. In addition, there's some complexity, obviously, to participating in trials, office visits, additional surveys, and some of the secrecy associated with blinded trials can also feed that mistrust, in addition to some of the social determinants that patients face, like time off from work. So these are really very key issues. Next slide, please. The lack of representation broadly in clinical trials has been recognized at the highest levels in our country. I think on the panel, we'll talk more about what's going on right now, but prior to the past few months, I would say at the highest levels of our nation, including the National Academy, there was consensus around the importance of clinical trial representation, and that if we didn't have it, it really compromised the generalizability of our clinical research, hindered innovation, could compound low accrual of trials, might undermine trust in clinical research when people don't feel like they're represented, and certainly could compound health disparities. Next slide. And we know that the people that are underrepresented in clinical trials also are people that are negatively affected by healthcare disparities, including racial and ethnic minorities, those with low socioeconomic status, un- or underinsured patients, immigrants, those with disabilities, those on either side of the age continuum, really young patients or elder patients, and sexual and gender minority communities. Next slide, please. We also recognize that geography and residence in a low resource setting can also limit clinical trial participation and contribute to health disparities. In fact, individuals living in rural areas have a 17% higher death rate from all cancers combined. Next slide, please. Moreover, financial distress has plagued rural America. For example, 2/3 of rural cancer survivors from Appalachia report financial distress. Appalachia is a big issue for us in Ohio, so we want to improve those outcomes and that access. Next slide. Importantly, financial distress can also lead patients to make tough decisions. We know that Black and Hispanic populations experience adverse financial impact twice as often as white patients, and this can lead to coping strategies like skipping medications. Next slide, please. There are also some other downstream effects of trial underrepresentation that relate to correlative science generated from trials. These are these very precious and well-characterized samples, tumor and tissue samples, that are used to better understand disease mechanisms, generate new hypotheses, and also ultimately generate new therapeutic strategies. So when our trials are homogeneous, we rob ourselves of the opportunity for discovery. And we see some of that in the very precious Cancer Genome Atlas that is somewhat homogeneous. We also know that people aren't reporting important identities of patients, such as race and ethnicity, and perhaps even geography. Next slide. So what is the impact? Next slide. When we think about, our full catchment area, in other words, the patients that we serve not being represented in trials, I believe we're really not serving our full community. In addition, when we think about the lack of heterogeneity in the trials in terms of patient identity and makeup and exposures in their communities, we're not really learning as much as we could be scientifically. And ultimately, I believe that means we're not gaining on health disparities. Next slide, please. If we think about representation in trials, what should that look like? The AACR published a cancer disparities report in 2022. And one of the studies they discussed is this one that included 93 cancer clinical trials, almost 6,000 patients. They looked at the ratio of actual number of patients enrolled and compared that to the expected based on US consensus. So over that red bar of 1 meant that you're overrepresented in trials, below that underrepresented. And you'll see that racial and ethnic minorities were underrepresented. Next slide, please. Having said that, we know that you can be intentional and have a plan about who's being accrued and enrolled into your trials. And this data that came from the National Academies Press reviewed the demographic representation in clinical trials in participants that are trials supported by the NIH. Now, again, this doesn't reflect the last few months, but previously, the NIH had a lot of influence about how we were thinking about patient enrollment, who would be enrolled, and what the plan was. So if you look at the data from 2018 and patients represented in trials and look at the 2023 census, you can actually say with that intentionality, there's actually been a fair amount of improvement over time in who's represented. Clearly the Hispanic population and other racial groups still have a ways to go, but I think that intentionality and planning is important. It's also, I think it's also inherent for us to think about this population type of representation versus prioritization. Let's go to the next slide. A great example of this is prostate cancer incidence, which we can see in this ACS report published over the last year and a half, where we're looking at racial and ethnic minority groups in the US with prostate cancer incidence across all stages of disease. What you see in the green line is that Black men have the highest incidence of prostate cancer across all stage groups. What that means is this is a high group population, high incidence population that should be prioritized in clinical trials related to prostate cancer. That's more the prioritization approach. Next slide, please. There's a number of initiatives underway trying to improve representation in trials. ASCO worked with the Friends of Cancer Research to create a joint research statement where they really looked at eligibility criteria and how we could expand these criteria, knowing that if you limit patients without a real basis to that criteria, we may be disenfranchising patients. What they ultimately reported on was that there could be a relaxation of brain metastases, limitations for patients with brain metastasis, early age, HIV infection, prior and current malignancies. Next slide. There are a number of strategies we can do to reduce the burden of clinical trials, and we employed a lot of these strategies during COVID. Next slide. Patient navigation is also an important expansion that we can use to improve strategies to increase our enrollment. And now those services are reimbursable. Next slide. We're doing some work at The Ohio State University, and I'm co-leading this study with Dr. Electric Pasquette across 9 counties in Ohio to increase racial and ethnic minority representation and looking at all of the different barriers that patients may face at different levels. Next slide. We have a 4-point plan to improve our minority accrual across all of these levels related to patient, provider, system, and also the community. Next slide. So I hope you'll agree that broader representation in clinical trials is critical, that there are barriers to participate in trials for patients, and these are multifactorial. There really needs to be national attention in our efforts to have progress, and that there are key strategies that we can employ to improve representation. Thank you. These are some tips that we need to think about. I suspect we'll talk about during the panel for those who are actually working on creating protocols, recruiting patients, and reporting data. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. That was so informative, and we keep talking about these barriers to clinical trials, which I'm sure are going to come up in the panel. It is my pleasure to now introduce our moderator for the panel, Dr. Kathleen Goss. Welcome, Dr. Goss, and I am turning it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lindsay, and really pleased to be here. What a fantastic group of presentations already. So I'm really super excited for this discussion. We could be here all day. There's so many topics to dig into based on what was shared earlier. But I'd like to get us started. You know, Cheryl, you alluded to the climate right now and that things are changing, certainly with respect to a focus on representation in clinical trials. Certainly there is the entire research ecosystem has been a bit turned on its head the last few months. And when I think of the story that Kathleen Bond shared about Jim and his experience in trials, you begin to worry about the impact of what we're going through right now and what that means to other patients who may not have the benefit of the types of access to trials that Jim had and were really transformative for his care. So I'd love, this is really for everybody, but can you all share with me your perspective and what the impact of the current certainly cuts to cancer research in general, and just sort of the ecosystem being turned on its head a bit, what that means to clinical trials. We certainly, probably most on this call, have heard anecdotes of trials pausing during this time and funding not being available for those trials. But I would love to just hear your perspective on sort of what's the current state and are there things that we can do to address that? And maybe, we could start with you, Cheryl, if you'd like, but I'd like to hear from all of you, especially Mark, from your perspective through ACS CAN.
Sure, and that's a fantastic question. I think we're in a period of uncertainty. I'll speak from the perspective of a large academic medical center with a comprehensive cancer center supported by the National Cancer Institute. When we see the kind of cuts coming and limitations on research and freezing of research studies, we know that this will directly affect clinical trials. And in fact, some trials that are ongoing. And we know that the clinical trial is what many patients rely on who no longer have a standard of care for treatment. This actually, a great example of this was when President Trump had COVID in his last administration. He was treated with a clinical trial with a novel drug. So the access to clinical trials is so important. We are still continuing to support as many trials as we can with our very generous donors, with our clinical mission at revenue, and we intend to do that. But there is a major impact for patients and for institutions. We also would like to think that there will be continued support in the future. We're going to get better and more efficient at how we can run trials. We're going to develop more relationships with industry, with the community. And so we will continue to prioritize clinical trials.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Mark or anyone else want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in as you mentioned. So, I work for ACS CAN, which is the Cancer Advocacy Network. We're the policy and advocacy arm of the ACS. And really our focus is trying to create a public policy environment that is conducive to innovation and translation of those innovation into final products. So we are acutely attuned to the administration's policies with respect to research funding. And I think, there are sort of two major themes here. There's sort of the macro research funding question, which has been touched on, but then there is also the specific policy issues. So, we had a funding freeze earlier this year that was then removed, but there's been a lot of rescissions, and grant making is way behind, scale as it was last year. We saw a proposed budget that's coming out of the White House. It's not finalized yet, but there was sort of a leak that up to a 40% cut at NIH. So there's definitely severe financial constraints on the research ecosystem, both already this year and potentially even worse next year. And so ACS CAN, we're all in trying to foster our congressional allies, because ultimately they have the power of the purse. So that's one issue. And again, I think it's really hard. We are actively monitoring the open clinical trials in oncology. Every other week we're doing a download to try and understand what impact this funding freeze has made on sort of the larger availability of trials to patients. But then there's the policy issue, and obviously there's been a sort of attack against anything DEI, and Congress just a couple of years ago had passed a law that requires folks submitting pivotal trials to the FDA to submit a diversity action plan. In other words, what is the demographic targets for your clinical trial? How did you pick them? Why? And what are you going to do to make sure that you meet those criteria? That is federal law. That's not sort of discretionary, that the administration decided to do it. Obviously, that is not popular in this administration, and the question is, will it remain or not? For now, it's still posted, but I think we definitely do see, major headwinds both from the funding and the policy standpoint. But I think, it's still continuing to make this is making the case scientifically. You want everybody you can in a clinical trial. Clinical trials are that translational step. And I do think from an advocacy standpoint, it's a little bit harder for somebody to understand some sort of like obscure protein chemistry grant that doesn't happen. But when you're talking about a clinical trial that gets cut and somebody's opportunity at the next shot, like James's story, I think those are really powerful. And so that's really why we're trying to bring clinical trial and the threat to it front and center in our advocacy work.
Thank you so much. Any additional thoughts from Shazia or Melinda?
I can say a couple things. One is one of the things that I'm really trying to do is encourage our faculty to advocate for, know what the bills are and advocate, because people feel kind of helpless right now as researchers and faculty. And so trying to give them some power to know what's happening and to advocate. And the other piece is, when you look at what the legislation wants to fund in the future, they're picking certain cancers over other cancers. And so, not every cancer will be impacted equally. And some of the cancers, for example, that might be impacted more are those that do highly impact, different populations, vulnerable populations. So understanding like that they're lung cancer and bladder cancer, for example, that the funding for them are much lower than other cancers. So, understanding that we're going to have some challenges in the future that we're going to have to manage, and already talking about how we're going to manage those things now is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say, a call to action for everyone to have your voice heard on these issues. We can never be too loud to make sure that as stakeholders, that we are talking to our legislators and making sure that we're advocating in any way that we can. It also gives me great joy. I work in our extramural, the American Cancer Society's extramural discovery science team. So we fund grants across the country, and feel very privileged at this time that we get to do that and continue to sort of put our heads down and keep the foot on the gas. Although, of course, we pale in comparison to what NIH and other parts of the federal government can fund. But certainly our commitment is stronger than ever, and it's more important than ever. So really, really proud to work for ACS right now, for sure. And just a friendly reminder to everyone, feel free to put additional questions in the chat or the Q&A function. That would be great. And if you all are providing comments in the chat that you want the entire group to see, be sure to select everyone so that you're sharing your thoughts and comments and questions with everyone. We'll try to get to your questions that have been asked in the Q&A and in the chat as we go. So maybe we'll turn to one of those. Shazia, I have a question for you. Well, I have two questions for you. One is my question, and it's about the multi-institutional effort that you described, that you all are a part of, that's funded by Stand Up to Cancer. And I'm struck by how important it is for institutions and investigators to come together, because they certainly, while they're institutional barriers, there are also common barriers. Can you speak to how, what are some of the advantages of multi-institutional studies like that, and what are some barriers? I think it just is so important as we're thinking about how to best leverage limited resources. Is that a path to help us sort of move more quickly?
Yeah, and I think one really wonderful thing about a lot of clinical trials is they have resources within them. A lot of pharma funded trials actually have resources to help with patient stipends for travel and costs and things like that. And those are parts of the trial discussion that maybe not every patient gets to discuss. So that's really important to talk about. And I think that's why having this multi-level approach is so important, that, our social workers, our navigators, they're addressing some of those components that maybe the patient's really not getting to be addressed in their clinic visit with their doctor, for example. And I think, something that's evolving in the way we treat cancer now, and in major cancer centers are kind of expanding their satellite campuses to rural areas, to inner city areas, in different neighborhoods. And so we really are, I think, becoming a broader and broader catchment area, but also those potential sites may not have that same trial, infrastructure to support it. And so and really, from the cost challenges that come with it, they may never have a full-on, dedicated trial unit at every satellite campus. But I think, empowering the clinicians at every campus across the Temple network, for example, in Philadelphia, is so important to educate about the importance of clinical trials, so that the local navigator, the local social worker, and the local clinicians see the value and start those conversations early. And then they kind of work together to overcome these barriers. And that might be a way to overcome the systemic issues, the provider issues, as well as the patient issue.
Great. And I think that follow-up is one that specific came in as a Q&A question about your work, and about are you using patient navigators to support your patients in clinical trials?
Yeah, so this is going to be an intervention that will be up and running in our grant. So our project is a 5-year project. The first year, which will start in July, will be the physician training. And then in the years 2 and 3, we'll implement a clinical trials dedicated clinical trials educator and coordinator program. So we're staggering the interventions and randomizing them so that we can understand the differences between what interventions are actually working, and really from a statistical standpoint, we're staggering them a little bit. But so we won't have that information yet, but the plan is at year 2 and 3 of the project, patients will be randomized to having this support network or not. And we'll try and understand, does this actually make a difference? And I think they'll almost serve as like a quarterback for coordinating clinical trial care. So it might be just for some patients, educating them, and they might not have a trial available for them because they don't meet criteria at the time, but we hope that they will at least lay the groundwork so that in the future, they will advocate for themselves to ask their provider or reach out to ACS or LLS or whatever organization and say, hey, do you have a trial for me maybe in another city, if that's something that makes sense? And then that person will also help guide them with social resources that might be necessary, right? So transportation, language services, what resources do we have coming from the city that could help support them for their cancer care? And there's a lot of untapped resources that we can really utilize for this. And of course, pre-screening is a really big challenge, right? So not a lot of providers have the time to do that. So we're hoping that that may, reach out, the navigator may, reach out to the provider and say, hey, I met this patient. They might be eligible for a study. Maybe you should talk to them about it when you see them in clinic next. And so we're hoping that this kind of teaches not only the providers and the patients, but creates this culture of trial discussions for patients throughout their journey.
That's so important. And I've heard that from all of you talking about that education piece and really helping people understand what trials are and what they aren't. I'd like to pull on that a little bit more. Melinda.
Can I make a
Oh,
quick
yeah,
comment?
please, please. Sorry, I didn't see
Yeah.
your hand.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to, echo the importance of patient navigation in our CUSP-2 CT study that is supported by the NCI. We are working to connect, underrepresented patients to clinical trials. And as we look at individual systems and individual clinics, literally trying to figure out what's the barrier to enrolling patients in that particular clinic, and then like Shazia's study, really working to, really develop very personalized interventions, and then looking at some of the results after those are in place. But the concept of the patient navigator is so important. Really, if we think about the just the challenge of navigating, creating appointments or scheduling appointments, translating documents, making child care appointments or plans. All of these issues can be very stressful for patients and their families. And the fact that we now can bill for the services of the patient navigator will hopefully make it easier for health systems to want to support the hiring of more navigators. I think we bought into the concept of patient navigators quite some time ago, so we have a fair number, but we have also wanted to expand as we try to reach more patients. I also want to just comment on the screening issue. I mean, we're now using Deep6 AI as a tool to try to rapidly screen clinics to identify patients that may be eligible. I agree with Mark's comments about the lack of available trials, and that plagues academia as well as non-academic centers and NCORPs and groups like that. But if you can use some type of tool like this, an AI tool, to really rapidly screen, at least you can try to get patients identified quickly for the trials that you do have open. So that is the smaller few bars you had on your slide, but we want to find strategies to be able to enhance that screening so we can then put the effort and mind share into developing new trials.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Really important points, and I especially appreciate you calling out the patient navigation piece. And at ACS, we've spent a lot of energy over the years, and especially in the last couple of years, really helping to support the navigation sort of infrastructure at centers, and being being a player around the reimbursement piece that you talked about. It's really critical. And I know one of my ACS colleagues is going to wrap us up after the panel and talk about some other tools and helpful things that ACS has done in that space. So that's certainly something near and dear to our hearts, but we all, many of us on this panel for sure, and all of us on the panel, many in the audience, know how important navigation is. It really can be such a game changer for so many. So on the topic of education and helping trials be accessible to patients, Melinda, I loved what you shared about your storytelling and the impact that is having on awareness and willingness to consider research studies. Can you talk more about so two things really. It's how does health literacy play into this? but also what strategies work to help educate patients. Your example is a beautiful one, and you're sort of maybe at the beginning to evaluate the impact of that approach. But I would just love to hear your thoughts on other ways that we can tackle this education piece and the barriers of health literacy.
Yeah, so when we started our We Engage for Health program, again, didn't start off in the research participation area. It was more for health promotion. We started off with the stories because we were trying to be able to talk with community members that had lower health literacies. And when COVID hit, people are kind of being used to being talked at, and we wanted to talk with, and we wanted them to feel safe in having that conversation and being open with, I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? And a lot of people don't always feel safe in doing that. So our stories allowed them that safe space to have those conversations where they can ask questions. And usually when we do the story sharing piece of it afterwards, our first question is, what did you learn from this? What was new to you? What did you not understand before? So we have kind of prompts to get them to start talking. One of the things that we learned through COVID is we were working with community health workers, and they were used to telling people what they should do. They should get vaccinated. They should. And so we kind of changed that. Our facilitators, our health champions, and our advocates are not trained to tell people what they should do, but rather to explore what their what the underlying issues were, that like someone says, I'm afraid of magnetic, the vaccine's going to make me magnetic. Well, that's a safety issue. They're worried about safety, or maybe they're worried about side effects, or maybe they're worried about, fertility for their kids. All those things may be myths, but rather than saying, oh, that's not right, that's wrong, saying, oh, what really sounds like you're worried about safety, or you're really worried about this. And so acknowledging the underlying concern and having a conversation and putting them in a place where they can talk about it without being told they're wrong, or having them get defensive. I think the discussion is a critical piece of education. The other piece is our stories talk a lot about the why and not just the what. Public health tends to tell people what to do and not why they should do it. Okay, we all wear COVID masks, for example. We're supposed to, get screened for cervical cancer. Why? And people don't understand why. And so our materials also kind of help people understand why they're supposed to do those things, not just that they're supposed to do them. And I think that's what we're missing in a lot of our educational materials, is we don't tell people why. And the last thing is that we overwhelm people with information. All of our stories have 3 big ideas. We don't try to be comprehensive. The discussion can be more comprehensive, but the stories themselves highlight the things we really want people to remember or know, and not anything more than that. Because when you start to add things, people don't remember more than 3 things. So 3 big ideas so that people can really understand and remember those 3 things. And our goal is to have them able to have that conversation with their family and friends themselves. They can say, hey, I was part of this program and we used this story and this is what happened and this is what we learned. It's always better for people to reteach other people, right? So that reteach model. So again, not having too much information. Our flyers even sometimes have way too much information on it. We don't need all that information. When we want to get people to do, very specific things, then we need to be clear with what we want them to do and help them to remember those things so that they can actually act upon them.
That's so helpful. I mean, those are really practical suggestions about how to make this easier and more digestible, and really help engage patients about these topics. There was a question, sort of a follow-up, a question in the chat specifically about this issue of needing education on what does the control group mean? What, are they going to get the medication or not get the medication? Placebo, those sorts of really fundamental issues. And I don't know if you have any specific suggestions about how to tackle some of those really general concerns, but can be an immediate, if someone doesn't understand what those terms are and think that I might not get the care that I need, that it's an immediate barrier to wanting even to have further conversations about it.
The control group thing actually was not in one of our original stories. We actually added it when we had a focus group of cancer survivors, and they said, one of the biggest things they were concerned about was that they didn't want to get a placebo. And what we talked about is that you're going to get standard of care, what's happening right now. You're not going to not be treated. And I think that's what people think control means, is not treated. And we really work on helping them understand that it's not a placebo. It's typically the standard of care. And then there's this extra layer a lot of times. But we also talk about, how to ask the clinician or the trialist about that. Like, what is the control group? What does that mean? And so, again, this is addressed in our story, and sometimes it comes up in our discussions, but that is a huge concern. So having that conversation about what that really means is critical in all your conversations.
Great, thank you. And I love the helpful hint from Dr. Nakota that about, standard of care or standard of care plus. That's terrific. That's a great way of putting it. Mark, I'm going to turn this next question over to you. And we've touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth some time discussing some of the financial barriers to participation in clinical trials, because that certainly can really impact participation and particularly diverse participation significantly. So can you speak to those financial barriers, and what are things that, what approaches can help alleviate some of those barriers?
Sure, thanks. Happy to talk a little bit about that. I talked about how different racial and ethnic groups will often accept trials at similar rates, but one group that accepts trial invitations at a very lower rate are those with lower income. So if you come from a household that makes $50,000 or less, you're about 30% less likely to say yes to a clinical trial invitation. So we know that sensitivities to any increased costs are really high for folks. And those costs can be, extra transportation and parking, gas, et cetera. I mean, anybody's gone to a cancer center, sometimes you have to pay $30 to park there, right? I mean, all those costs add up, and it's also costs that are not necessarily reimbursable like a receipt. There are things like lost work, right? And then, you have the medical cost too. Patients are still responsible for their standard of care co-payments and things like that. So knowing that is one of those pragmatic barriers that leads some folks to say no, who otherwise philosophically are happy to participate, they just can't for financial reasons. We know that financial support can make a big difference there, but not all sponsors do that. And there are business and legal reasons. And so ACS CAN, for several years now, has worked on trying to address some of those public policy and legal issues. And there's a couple of laws that sometimes are seen as problematic to doing this. They're called the anti-kickback statute and the civil monetary penalty statute. And those were really designed to prevent people from sort of quote unquote bribing people to get care that was billed to, say, like Medicare. Not really applicable to this, but still some people who are, some sponsors who are really conservative in terms of not wanting to do anything that could be seen as potentially illegal, might stay away from offering financial support. So we have, both through introduction of legislation called the Clinical Trial Modernization Act, as well as through regulatory comments to the Health and Human Service Office of Inspector General, which is sort of the law enforcement arm of HHS, have requested clear safe harbors for sponsors who want to provide financial support to patients. Now, with that said, many sponsors will already do this because we feel it's an essay. I'm not offering you legal advice, but many sponsors do it, and there's never been an issue. But the issue for like a site, you need to make sure you're asking for that support in your contract if you're opening up a clinical trial. Sometimes there's third-party financial support as well, but it's best to get it from the sponsor if you can. The flip side of that is that if it's a stipend, patients can actually be taxed on, receiving financial support to be in a clinical trial. So this legislation would also create a safe harbor that says that if you're on a clinical trial receiving a stipend, the first $2,000 is not taxable. And importantly, it's not just a tax issue, but for low-income folks who are on, say, for example, Medicaid, that extra income of the stipend can right now kick them off of Medicaid eligibility. So really important issues that if we want sponsors to routinely provide financial support to patients, we need to make sure both the sponsors don't feel like it's going to get them in trouble and the patients are comfortable receiving it and not, getting kicked off their safety net. So really important aspects and some policy areas that we've been highly focused on over the last few years.
Great, so important. Thanks so much for that, Mark. Cheryl. Oh, I don't think we can hear you.
I was just going to say, I think those are tremendous efforts in really trying to work, from a policy perspective. I do think we were in the chat a little bit just talking about some very basic strategies to help with the cost of transportation, which is often a major limiting factor for those with low socioeconomic status and having to take time off from work. But using electronic consenting is something that can help. Using telehealth evaluations, home delivery of medications so they don't have to come in to get a drug, using a local lab or a radiographic center or image center. I think all of these things can make trials more accessible, and sometimes people can do these things during their lunch hour, do a telehealth on a break. I've certainly done telehealth visits with patients while they're at work. So those are just some basic strategies to help at the ground level, while some of the policy, is making its way through local and federal governments.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, I was struck by your your effort that you and Electra are leading, and the sort of 4-point plan, and really coming at this from all of the levels to address some of these things that you just spoke to. And I would love to just hear from you how, through your experience with that effort, can you talk about the partnerships that you've had to develop and to be able to reach people where they are? Because I know you're reaching, rural communities and folks all throughout your catchment area. And so I would love to hear sort of what your strategies have been to kind of take, it's really ambitious, say, okay, I'm going to look at it at all these levels, but you can't do everything, and you certainly can't do it on your own. So I would just love to hear lessons learned from you that others may benefit from that are on the call.
Sure. And this is a 5-year study, so it does take some time.
Yeah, of course.
We have partnerships at so many different levels, even with the patients, patient navigators, their families. That's a major important nidus for partnership and understanding what their needs are. At the provider level, and trying to increase the number of kind of diverse, faculty and clinicians that are actually engaging with patients. We've partnered with our Cancer Center leadership and our College of Medicine to try to affect that and prioritize that. We have also partnered quite a bit with our disease-specific research groups that are, kind of these folks that are doing trials and leading trials are part of, to really give them awareness to who they are actually enrolling through the creation of a clinical trials dashboard. And that includes not only racial and ethnic minorities, but those at either end of the age spectrum, particularly our elder population. We've partnered with our own system in thinking about how we can improve the way patients engage with our electronic health record, how we can improve in our translation services, how we can improve with the way people identify themselves and the way we obtain that data. So across the board, now the most exciting and fun partnership has also been the community. And by community, I mean, literally, we're looking at 9 counties that have the highest cancer case counts in kind of racial and ethnic residents. And literally working with folks that are in smaller health systems, in NCORPs, some of these NCI supported clinical trials units, and really engaging in structural interviews with them, They're, not only the docs, the research nurses, the administrative team, some patients in that region, to say, what are the challenges that you're facing? And we're literally responding to those individual challenges with interventions. So it's literally talking with local, clinical trialists. And, we're fortunate to have a relationship with Bon Secours Mercy. So there are large health systems throughout the state, multiple health systems related to them. And we have this research, partnership where we're literally saying, in these counties, can we partner with some of your docs and health systems in those counties? So it's just been a partnership across the state, within our system, and at every level.
Yeah, and a heroic effort. I made a note, something that you said, Cheryl, that I just loved and I think is worth repeating for everyone. When you were presenting, when our trials are homogeneous, we rob ourselves of opportunities for discovery. And, that should be a North Star for us. So thank you. And for those additional insights about how you're making it, how you're actually, making it all happen, because it's a tremendous effort. I'd love to ask this question of anyone in the panel can jump in on this one, but it was in the chat about barriers for providers and institutions, specifically about physician effort, provider effort, and RVU generation. And several of you mentioned this, that, there are barriers with respect to a lack of time and financial constraints. So how have you seen progress on that front from an incentive or motivation standpoint, so that providers are really engaged in clinical trials more? And what has worked, what hasn't worked, and everything in between.
I can just jump in briefly. So we did a few years ago a survey of about 700 oncology professionals, so it was both nurses and oncologists and research coordinators across the United States, and asked sort of, how do you screen? Do you screen? If you don't, why? And I think what we've heard already is, it's a lack of time and tools and awareness. So how do you even know what trials are available on your own, campus, on neighboring campuses? The time it takes to do that screening evaluation. So I do think, there are ways and tools. We have a sort of a pilot project called the Blue Button Clinical Trial Project, trying to address some of those issues, but many others. AI is exploding now. So part of it is, make that level of effort less. It's still going to be a level of effort. So that one is, I think technology. Two is think about, who can do that, and can somebody like a nurse or somebody else, or even a layperson, in the office, do the pre-screening and leave that last mile to the clinician, so that you're sort of maximizing the value. But in the end, it really does take time, right? You can't automate the whole thing. It takes time. And so what we have seen traditionally is, sometimes in smaller community practice, you might have somebody who's just a person who is passionate about it, and they find time to do it. But that's not a system-wide solution, right? It has to come from institutions. And in the surveys, we did see the impact of COC accreditation. So depending on the size of your practice, there is a benchmark you have to hit of clinical trial enrollment. So things like those accreditation metrics can be key drivers. But again, I think, the site has to be invested in it. I think understanding the financials, obviously, if you open more industry trials, the finances of getting folks on industry trials is a lot different than NIH trials. So it takes a systems level planning, and it's not just going to happen organically.
Yeah, commitment to change. Cheryl or anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that question, because really it's just about the practicality of having the time to do trials. And I agree that it is an institutional commitment. Now, we had a compensation structure not too long ago that allowed clinicians to kind of earn 5% effort to work in non-clinical space and research if they were the PI of 4 clinical trials. And in fact, you could earn up to 20% of your effort in this way. So if you were a PI on 8 trials, you get 10% effort and time to work on those trials. Now, unfortunately, during COVID, we lost that feature because of some financial pressures. But that's the kind of programming that I think we need to really think about. For our medical oncologists, actually, they're hired with protected time to do clinical trials because it is so critical to our cancer center support grant and the work that we do for our catchment area. But I think we really are going to have to, prioritize this type of work and effort. And then we're just going to have to give people the time or give them a path to earn that time to do the work.
Anything else related to that question? I know it's a tough one, but
I think one of the most important things is having that support infrastructure in place. So navigators, lay people that or educators, those folks can take a lot of that burden off from a time standpoint. But I also think partnerships between like a local oncologist and a cancer center is so important. I think there's always this concern that, well, I'm going to send my patient to a cancer center that has a trial open. They might not send the patients back, but having that relationship is really important, and realizing that, we need to outreach to our local oncologists as well, that we are just the way that you'd refer to somebody for a radiation oncology treatment or a stem cell transplant. You're getting referred to a clinical trial site that may be doing some of that interventions that we don't have the infrastructure for example, or necessarily the time to go into the clinical trials. And then we send those patients back for their next line of therapy potentially. So I think kind of that especially for patients that are more RVU driven, and a lot of academic centers, maybe that RVU drive isn't there, and we maybe have more time to spend with those patients to talk about clinical trials. I think that could potentially overcome some of those barriers too.
thank you so much. That was such an important point, and I know something that's often top of mind even from a patient perspective. What am I able to go to a trial that's at another institution? How does that work? Am I then able to go back to where I was being cared for? So it can be very complicated, but I think the point is that partnership is key here. Okay, I think we've got just about 4 minutes left of our conversation, which is perfect timing because I'd like to give each of you a minute. We covered a lot of ground, but as I said, we could be here all day. So I know we didn't touch on everything. So I'd like to give each of you a minute or so. If there's anything that we neglected to go into any detail about, or any final sort of take-home messages that you'd like to share with the group, I'd love to hear it. Maybe Melinda, we'll start with you if you don't mind, not to put you on the spot.
I would just say that as the legislative changes have happened, having greater financial support in other ways, like from donors, is going to be really critical, and really expressing to donors that there is a huge need is going to be critical. And working with our development group is becoming more important, because we want to be able to support people who are having struggles and may want to be on a trial but don't have the funds to be able to support the transportation and other things. So working to be able to communicate well what the need is to those people that are willing to support financially is going to be a critical piece.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Melinda. Who'd like to go next? Cheryl, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I just say, for those who are out there who are writing trials or getting studies started, please remember to expand the group that you invite to be part of the trial, so that that's a tool to increase representation in trials. As you're writing your protocols, think about relaxing your eligibility criteria, reduce the burden on the patients that are participating, use those COVID level strategies that we used then. Track race and ethnicity. We didn't have a chance to talk about it, but reporting is a major issue for us to understand who's involved in trials. And then I would say, as you're recruiting participants, really leverage some of the partners that you may not even know that you have: community advisory boards, patient navigators, a cancer center, Center for Community Outreach and Engagement. All of those folks can help bring awareness to trials and help support enrollment.
Thank you so much. Shazia.
Yeah, I think as a clinical investigator, I think it's so important that we educate ourselves about a lot of the legal implications that come with all of this, because so often we get kind of entrenched in the scientific discussions with our colleagues, and it's really important that we start spreading awareness about clinical trial design being more inclusive. So something that comes with word of mouth for sure.
Yes, such an important message. Okay, bring us home, Mark.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always like to drive home is that patients are generally willing and interested in participating in clinical trials if you ask them and you help them with their practical barriers. I think the one slide that I showed, I know probably more of the staff, I'm guessing, on this call are from cancer centers, but that slide I showed that shows a 5-fold difference in enrollment at cancer centers versus the community. We know that more folks are seen in the community than cancer centers, and that's where the infrastructure is lacking. And we need to find some way to provide support to those practices. We're working on it both from are there new grant mechanisms or something from NIH? But, given the financial constraints of federal funding, I think it's incumbent on cancer centers to find ways to create tighter networks with non-academic smaller sites in their community to help share resources and make it easier to conduct those clinical trials, or at least recruit in the community, because that's really where the patients are. So we need to, again, think about that first graph I showed and realize that there are so many patients out there who never get the chance to say yes, and think hard how you can ask more people to say yes.
Yeah, we can do better. Thank you so much. This was fantastic discussion. Really appreciate your insights and just you sharing your time with us this morning. So thank you all so much. And Lindsay, I think I turn it back over to you.
Yes. Wow, I think what was most evident in all of your answers is just how passionate you all are about coming up with solutions and meeting cancer patients and their families where they are. And that is incredible. So thank you all for the information and the ideas. And we just really appreciate your time and talent and treasure today. Our last speaker is Dr. Pia Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is a clinical I always struggle with this when I introduce you, neuropsychologist and the inaugural director of Cancer Innovation and Transformation at the American Cancer Society, where she leads digital health and care delivery innovation, including several palliative care initiatives. Her career spans executive leadership at health tech companies, cancer survivorship research, and care delivery at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and UCLA Neuro-Oncology and consulting at the Advisory Board Company. She completed her undergraduate degree at MIT, her master's degree and PhD in clinical psychology at Washington University in St. Louis, and her postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA. Dr. Banerjee, thank you for being here, and I'm so excited for you to share this awesome resource with our audience today.
Yes, thank you so much, Lindsay. And also thank you so much to our amazing panelists that we just heard from. Such amazing insights this morning. So really amazing to hear from all of you. I'm excited to tell you about ACS ACTS, which stands for Access to Clinical Trials and Support. We just launched 2 months ago, so really exciting updates and some information about this program for you all. Next slide, please. So we heard a lot today about a number of barriers to clinical trial participation. As a reminder, only 7% of cancer patients participate in clinical trials. And we did also hear that the representation from underrepresented communities is only at about 4%, and not because they're actually saying no, but because they're not actually offered these trials in the first place. And on the other end of this ecosystem, 20% of cancer trials are failing due to insufficient enrollment. And we've seen a number of barriers that were talked about today. Dr. Nakota talked about the limited awareness that patients may have because providers don't have the time in their appointments to actually talk about trials or even to research the trials that are needed. We heard from Dr. Fleury talk about trial match challenges, including not having on-site trials available. eligibility complexity, trying to navigate whether a patient is actually eligible for a trial is very complex in itself. Kathleen Bond shared about some of the administrative burden. So travel, she packed up a lot of her things with Jim and being able to move forward and being able to move to another location for a trial. All the panelists today have talked about the financial burden that's associated with clinical trials, from transportation to lodging to even things like loss of time from work. And this financial burden really adds to the health-related social needs and the burden that happens from that as well. So if you think about an individual that may have trouble getting food on the table for their family or paying their rent, the likelihood that they're going to be really thinking about clinical trials is a high priority for them, and trying to navigate the ecosystem to try to find a good match is pretty low. And so we want to be able to address all of these barriers. Next, please. So our solution is to launch ACS ACTS. This is in collaboration with Massive Bio that provides AI-based clinical trials matching. And I know Dr. Lee mentioned a bit about using AI to help facilitate trial matches. And so in this collaboration between Massive Bio and ACS, we're able to provide personalized clinical trial options, but also facilitate the wraparound support that is needed for patients to reduce all of these barriers that they may experience. Next, please. So ultimately for ACS ACTS, we want to provide end-to-end support for advancing health equity in clinical trials. Ultimately, we want to reduce all of the barriers that I've described. And the key constituents here, so the people that this program is available to are patients, to caregivers, and also to healthcare providers. So we offer different services for all of these groups and really customize your experience depending on which group you may be part of. And so the way that somebody can enter into the program is first by either going to our website, which is cancer.org/acts, ACTS, and I'll put a link at the end for you to be able to access that, or to call our 24/7 contact center. And then you're connected with a trained specialist who, if it's a patient, can provide clinical trials education. So, increasing their understanding of what is a clinical trial and exploring, is this even the right option for that individual? And then also providing health-related social needs screening. So again, we want to be able to make sure we can address all of these barriers. And if a barrier for them is that they can't pay their rent or they're having trouble with transportation to all of their medical appointments, we want to be able to help facilitate that. And then if the patient is interested in trying to understand what trials they may be able to match with, we then do a warm handoff to Massive Bio. And so Massive Bio will then help alleviate this administrative burden for the patient. So they will be able to collect the patient's medical records with consent, obviously, from the patient. They'll be able to help facilitate new orders that might need to be placed, like if they need biomarker testing or labs that need to be done. They can help the patient get those as well. And then they provide an AI-based clinical trials matching list. And so I know we heard from Dr. Lee about the importance of using AI to help facilitate and really help this infrastructure as a whole. And so we're leaning on AI here to be able to help provide really strong matches and personalized matches for that individual. And then if the patient does want to proceed in enrolling in a trial, to actually help that enrollment process and to work with the clinical trial site to get the patient enrolled. And we don't want to end at that point. We want to make sure that we can also help facilitate the long-term participation in that trial. So does the patient need transportation assistance to get to the trial? We can connect them to Road to Recovery, which is an ACS program. Or we can connect them to our Hope Lodges for free lodging at that trial site, and a number of other programs that we also connect individuals with and continue to screen for as they participate in this trial. Next, please. So the program eligibility criteria here is pretty broad. So it's open to all ages. So pediatric trials are included. It's open to all cancer types. Right now, from a location perspective, for our launch that we did just starting 2 months ago, we started with a regional launch. And this is for patients who are living in or willing to travel to the Northeast region. So there's 15 states that are currently included right now. And the reason we started with the Northeast region is because this is where there's the largest concentration of clinical trial sites in the US. And it also includes regions where ACS can help provide, we have a greater concentration of Hope Lodges in this region, and we're able to provide some of the Road to Recovery services a little bit more easily than perhaps in the Midwest. And so as a starting point, we wanted to start there, take our learnings, and then in fall, we plan to do a national launch. So it'll be open to all of the domestic US. And really the only criteria beyond that is that the patient is interested in exploring eligible clinical trials. There's no commitment needed from them. And the trials that they will be matched with are all interventional cancer clinical trials that are in clinicaltrials.gov. So as long as it meets the criteria of being an interventional trial, that it's a cancer trial, and that it's listed there, it's one that they will potentially be matched with. Next, please. We also help facilitate meeting COC standard 9.1. So if you are a COC accredited institution, or if you are looking for accreditation, we can help facilitate that as well. Next, please. And so I did want to share with you some of the exciting metrics from our first 8 weeks. So in our first 8 weeks, we've had 256 people who have reached out to us about interest in our clinical trials program. And we've been able to educate these individuals on what clinical trials are and see if they want to explore being able to be matched with a trial. We've also found that 75% of these individuals who reached out to us have health-related social needs, and we specifically screen for ones that ACS can actually do something about, that we have programs to help facilitate. So we're able to help facilitate these needs with 729 different unique needs that we have identified. Next, please. And so if you are interested in learning more about ACS ACTS, you can sign up for ACS ACTS, and you can either call our 24/7 phone line or go to our website, cancer.org/ACTS. You can use our QR code on the left for that. And if you'd like to learn more, we do have a 1-hour webinar next Wednesday. So the QR code on the right, feel free to scan and register for our Zoom call there. That'll just be us talking about the program, talking about how it helps facilitate the COC standard 9.1, and also being able to answer any questions that you may have with about a half-hour Q&A. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. This program is so helpful, and excited to see those numbers continue to grow. We're going to wrap up with a few additional resources for everybody. The American Cancer Society National Navigation Roundtable is a coalition of organizations dedicated to ensuring all patients have equitable access to quality cancer care through effective patient navigation. Something we've heard a lot about today, so hopefully this will be a helpful resource for you. The mission of this coalition is to assure high-quality cancer care for all through this evidence-based patient navigation. Previous webinars are archived on the website, and information about upcoming webinars will also appear on ACS and NRT's social media channels. We want you to stay connected to keep up with events, announcements, and other opportunities. So if you want to learn more, go to www.navigationroundtable.org. And they've also put that link in the chat to make it easier for you. Lastly, we hope that you will continue joining us for the remainder of these virtual forum sessions. In July, we'll be exploring issues around food and nutrition. And in August, we will discuss current issues navigating immunotherapy. And then finally, in November, we will discuss rural health. 2 CMEs will be available for each of the live sessions. Lastly, I apologize, there was one more thing. We've got a couple more housekeeping items, and we'll get you out of here. We are also pleased to share that this program that we had today and all of our previous webinars are available on YouTube. CMEs are only available for the live event, but please share what you've heard here today with your colleagues, or check out any of the sessions that you might have missed. As a reminder, the CME certificate will be sent out in 2 weeks once you've completed the post-event survey. The survey will pop up at the close of today's session, and you will also receive a post-event email with the recording of the session and the survey link, just in case you missed it this morning. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I want to thank our panelists again for bringing just so much knowledge and solutions to access to cancer care for patients and their families. And we just want to thank you, everyone who's joined us, for your commitment to fighting a world to create a world without cancer. Thank you so much.